Today's Morning Brew is brought to you by
Welcome back to the Morning Brew and our very special in-depth coverage of the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Conference 2021. As promised, we're being joined by, this is our second newsmaking interview of the show. We're being joined by Mark Loquan. He's the president of the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago, and Dr. Vernon Paltoo is the president of National Energy. And while we're definitely going to be talking about the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Conference, we're going to focus on the greening of the local energy sector. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Now, the theme of this year's conference is leading the Caribbean's energy transition. Given the changes taking place on the global level with multinational countries being forced to adopt stricter green measures in the last few weeks, as a major energy company for the state, how is NGC positioning itself to address the global green agenda? Mr. Loquan?
Thanks for that question. Before you would have seen NGC and across the group, NE and so on, positioning already over a long period of time, where of course you would have seen that we are in CNG, which is also part of the displacement of gasoline and diesel, as well as the the whole positioning in renewables, and Vernon could speak more about that. But more than that, we have also been supplying LNG, and we've been supplying LNG as far as China, where they're using coal, as well as to the Caribbean. And so we're positioning ourselves in those areas, particularly in the Caribbean, where we, as Dax have mentioned, there's a distinct thrust to change the energy mix in the Caribbean, and of course being positioned right here in the south of the Caribbean makes it ideal for those islands around us. You would have also seen, what is getting the attention quite a lot is the CO2, carbon dioxide, that is contributing to the heating up of the planet. But what is now getting a lot of international attention is methane. So even though methane is the second largest contributor to the whole emission, it's far more potent in that it keeps the heat on the planet 84 times as much than CO2 in a 20-year period. So you would have found that NGC would have been positioning itself in getting infrared cameras so that you can measure leaks along the chain. We're getting into satellite technology that will be looking at methane emissions for Trinidad and Tobago, as well as positioning in global groups such as the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which has 60-something countries across 5 continents already part of it, and going into the measurement and monitoring of methane, this potent greenhouse gas. And there are the other areas, of course, like the hydrogen and so on, which Vernon can speak to. But on a broad basis, you can see us changing the way how we work as a group, and how we trying to get into the monitoring space and using technology that we never used before.
Well, when we're measuring for those leaks, are we doing enough to, I don't know, do you capture methane? Do you redirect it? Are those things that we are addressing locally as well?
I think there's a lot of room to go, because as there's flaring and there's venting and there's various things happening across the chain. If you look at the data, it's about 40% happens in the oil side, whereas about 60% happens across the whole gas chain. So in terms of redirecting, the technology tells you where your biggest priority should be, whereas before it's not easily visible as carbon dioxide would be, right? So it's using the technology to get the resources in the right space and redirect it back in the system.
And Dr. Paltoo, you are going to be, well, both of you all are going to be speaking on Tuesday. Mr. Loquan is going to be on the Platinum Speaker Panel, which is the first discussion for tomorrow, Tuesday, the 8th of May. And Dr. Paltoo, you will be speaking on a little later in the morning on the role of hydrocarbon in the energy transition. Let's talk about that. What role is hydrocarbon playing locally?
Well, actually, Soyini, it is actually hydrogen, not hydrocarbon, the role that hydrogen is going to play. Okay, and really what we are doing is looking holistically at the region, and specifically Trinidad and Tobago, in the first instance in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, as Mark would have indicated. And ultimately, what we want to do is create an energy sector across the Caribbean that is low in terms of carbon emissions and carbon utilization. And how we would map this and how we are planning to do this is really a gradual transition into hydrogen, which is a carbon neutral or carbon free fuel. And our intention is to actually, lay out the groundwork, lay out a roadmap to enable Trinidad and Tobago initially to transform its economy, its energy sector, into a lower carbon, situation or a lower carbon scenario, and from there driving the entire region in terms of, low carbon energy usage. And how is that going to be accomplished? Essentially, it is by using natural gas as a transition fuel, and Mark will speak a little bit about that in a little while. And from natural gas as a lower carbon transition fuel, it is about using renewable energy, primarily wind and solar in the first instance in Trinidad and Tobago, to augment our natural gas-driven power at this point in time. And from there, after we drive the transition from gas usage in the power generation sector towards renewable energy, it is then from there we in parallel develop hydrogen technology in terms of producing a clean input for both the power generation, the transportation, and even the petrochemical sectors. And in doing so, what we ultimately do is future-proof the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago. We are ultimately going to ensure sustainability of the energy sector, of the petrochemical sector, by enabling the industry in Point Lisas to continue to operate with different raw materials as we transition from gas into hydrogen. And so it's a holistic plan. It is not going to happen today, but we are literally, laying the framework today.
Is it a plan that will help us meet the International Energy Agency's zero emissions by 2050 plan, or what's the timeline?
Well, so that is set out, those targets are set out by international agencies. We in Trinidad and Tobago, based on the Paris Accord, would have, certain targets. For example, 30%, carbon reduction by 2030. In fact, it's 15% carbon reduction emissions by 2030 and 10% renewable energy by 2021. We are well on our way to establishing those targets. And this, in essence, is building the foundation to get us to net zero at a later date. We have not established a time frame yet, but we expect by 2050 we'll be very close to that position of net zero carbon emissions.
Mr. Loquan, let me bring you back to the conversation. How is natural gas going to feature in the energy transition of Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, I think if you look at all the the strategies from the majors who are operating right here in Trinidad, I think a lot of them would say that while there's a focus on hydrogen and renewables, gas still represents a major focus for the transition for the future. So you see the majors are restructuring. They're focusing on positioning for a greener future, but they're still keeping the LNG business and sort of the gas assets to be in good working order without investing in the new areas. But it's clear that the energy mix in Trinidad is moving towards cleaner energy. That's where the whole globe is going, and Trinidad and Tobago is positioned well in the sense that it is already a gas predominant society economy, and the thing about it is we already are also well positioned for the Caribbean. We also have a lot of players in the upstream and downstream world whose corporate boardrooms are also talking quite a lot about the green future. So if whether you take ammonia or methanol or even the upstream, you still see the nutrients and the Yaras and MHTLs and Methanex also talking green methanol, green ammonia, hydrogen. So that bodes well for the collaboration and clustering that is required, that is required more than ever before, because one of the things that is probably lost in this whole green future is the speed by which we need to move and the urgency by which needs to happen. And it's not a case that we can just say, well, let's have a conference and that solves everything. It's really now how we work. It's about policy. It's about planning for a long period of time.
Mr. Loquan, not to interrupt you, but do you think we're moving fast enough?
Well, the data would show that, if you look at the World Economic Forum, Energy Transition Index, which looks at two major factors. One is the system, that's like how equitable and secure is your electricity supply and so on, compared to the transition side, which is the policy, the level of regulatory commitment, governance, business innovation, and that side of things. You will see Trinidad scoring, out of 115 countries, we're number 85. So there's a way to go, and certainly, if I have to get a message out this morning, it's of course positioning for that future, but you have to do it in a way that there's urgency involved, and of course that is set and driven by policy. It's driven by how fast you approaching your standards legislation and carbon tracking and so on, which is required to ensure that you are going in the right direction.
Dr. Paltoo, I want to bring you back to the conversation. As you corrected me, you are discussing the role of hydrogen in the energy transition tomorrow at about 9:30. We are going to be talking to one of your panel mates later on in the show, Philip Julian of New Gen Energy. What are you most looking forward to in that discussion that you'll be having tomorrow?
So, essentially, we would have started the entire process of decarbonization already. And that New Gen project helps in the whole concept of reducing our carbon footprint. But as Mark would have indicated, some urgency is needed. We have just started this process. We are actually ahead of many other countries. But given the unique position we are within the Caribbean, it is important that we drive this and drive it aggressively. Simply put, because we have the technological know-how in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the capacity, and we have the infrastructure. So what we would like to see happen really is to harness the resources from not just Trinidad and Tobago, but the region in terms of accelerating and driving this transformation. And how is that going to be accomplished? Really, from the perspective of producing green hydrogen, which requires renewable energy, we may be able to do that to augment and to deliver green hydrogen to drive the energy sector and the transportation sector. But when it comes to our energy industry and our large petrochemical sectors, we have a global scale petrochemical sector and LNG production. We would need to harness renewable energy from other regions in order to provide and produce hydrogen to enable that transformation. And what we want to see is collaboration among stakeholders, particularly Caribbean region, in terms of utilizing resources from the other regions, from the other countries. We have, been
Dr.
blessed.
Paltoo, how are we in terms of collaboration? Are we collaborating enough, or are we kind of still working in silos?
No. So that process would have started, Soyini. And it is, a very complex process simply because there are so many different countries. But as a region, we are united in terms of understanding the urgency and the need for this transformation. And so up to, even as recent as last week, there was a meeting of Caribbean energy ministers where it was discussed in terms of the importance of, this transformation and working together. And so Trinidad and Tobago will play an important role in terms of, creating this environment to drive the change.
So we are speaking to Dr. Vernon Paltoo, who is the President of National Energy of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mark Loquan, who's the president of the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago. Both will be speaking tomorrow in tomorrow's sessions of the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Conference 2021. You will see Mr. Loquan first. He is going to be taking part in the sponsors panel, which begins at 7:20 in the morning. And then he will be followed by Dr. Paltoo's panel. That general panel is on the role of natural gas in decarbonization. Dr. Paltoo will be focusing on the role of hydrogen in the energy transition. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right, looking forward to those two conversations. We're going to be taking a very quick break, but we'll come back with more right after this.